Marilyn Monroe's name had echoed across every corner of America. Yet behind her glamorous smile and glittering Hollywood image there lived a woman who carried a weight few could imagine. Her life was filled with flashes of cameras, the applause of crowds, and the whispers of powerful men who surrounded her. But beneath the sparkle there was a secret, one she had tried to reveal before her death. A truth so heavy that no one truly listened. It was not the kind of secret that belonged to scandal sheets or gossip magazines, but one that touched the heart of politics, power, and her own desperate search for meaning in a world that consumed her. It began in the early 1960s at the peak of her fame. Marilyn had already been through 3 marriages, each one collapsing under the weight of her loneliness and her dependence on pills that kept her moving when her body begged for rest. Reporters captured her every movement, but they never captured her silence, the hours when she sat in her Brentwood home, scribbling in notebooks with a shaky hand. In those notebooks she wrote things that frightened her friends when they glimpsed them, observations about the men she had been close to, reflections on the pressures of Hollywood, and fragments of conversations she was never supposed to repeat. She had once whispered to a friend that she had seen and heard things that would change the way people think about everything. At first it sounded like the melancholy talk of a lonely actress, but soon her words gained sharper edges. She mentioned evenings when she was invited to private gatherings with men whose names controlled the country. There, away from the cameras, she witnessed a different side of America. A side where the charm of leaders dissolved into backroom discussions of power, of war, and of secrets not meant for the public. Marilyn had been romantically linked with President John F. Kennedy, and whispers followed her about his brother Robert. While the world painted her as a starlet chasing thrills, the reality was more complicated. She felt used, as if she had been paraded into rooms where she did not belong, hearing fragments of conversations not meant for her ears. She once wrote in her diary that she felt like a pawn in a game being played by men who wore smiles in public, but dealt in shadows behind closed doors. The more she wrote, the more she became convinced that the world needed to know what she carried inside. But Marilyn's voice, so adored when she sang "Happy Birthday, Mr. President" in a glittering gown, was ignored when she tried to speak of what mattered most. Friends brushed her off, assuming it was just her fragile state of mind. Her psychiatrist warned her not to confuse fantasy with reality, but Marilyn insisted that she was not imagining things. She said she had heard discussions about Cuba, about weapons, about political strategies whispered in bedrooms when powerful men thought she was too drunk or too distracted to notice. By the summer of 1962, she had grown restless and agitated. Those closest to her recalled moments when she declared she was going to go public. She talked about holding a press conference, about revealing truths that would shock not only Hollywood but Washington itself. Her housekeeper would later recall finding scraps of paper on her nightstand filled with hurried, half-coherent notes, names circled and underlined, dates that seemed connected to meetings no one else knew she had attended. Marilyn was desperate but also afraid. She feared that the more she tried to speak, the less anyone would take her seriously. She feared being dismissed as a broken actress chasing attention. On the night of August 4, 1962, the world remembered only that she was found dead in her bedroom. The official story told of an overdose, a tragic ending to a troubled star. But those who had spoken to her in her final days remembered something different. She had been planning to meet with a journalist she trusted, someone who might give her words the platform they needed. She had rehearsed in her mind how she would say it, calm, clear, undeniable. She wanted the world to know that behind the glamour, behind the presidents and the actors, there existed a hidden truth she had carried alone. The tragedy of Marilyn Monroe was not only in her passing, but in the silence that followed. Her notebooks disappeared, her letters vanished, and those who once claimed to be her friends fell quiet. Decades later, fragments surfaced, diary entries hinting at her frustration, phone records showing late-night calls to government officials, and testimonies from people who recalled her saying, "They don't want me alive if I tell it." But by then, the world had already moved on, preferring the image of the tragic blonde over the reality of a woman burdened with knowledge. Marilyn Monroe's final secret was not only about the powerful men she knew, but about her attempt to step out of the role that had been written for her. She wanted to be more than a symbol, more than a fantasy for audiences. She wanted to be a voice. But in those final hours when she reached for someone to listen, no one did. The cameras recorded her beauty, the headlines replayed her scandals, but her warning was drowned out. Her last attempt to tell the world remained hidden in the shadows, leaving behind the haunting question: what exactly did Marilyn Monroe know? And why was no one willing to hear her? In the weeks that followed Marilyn Monroe's death, the silence surrounding her life grew deafening. Newspapers plastered her photograph on front pages, but the articles reduced her to a cautionary tale. A woman broken by fame, love, and addiction. What they did not print, what they refused to print, were the whispered accounts of the final days before her passing. Several of her closest friends who had visited her in Brentwood remembered her speaking with a strange intensity, as if she was preparing for something monumental. She was tired of being dismissed as the dumb blonde. She wanted to be taken seriously. She wanted her words to matter. One of those friends, a fellow actress who had spent hours by Marilyn's side, later recalled how Marilyn clutched a leather-bound notebook and said, "They think I'm fragile, but I've written everything down. Every word they said, every meeting I was brought into, every time they slipped and forgot I was there." The actress brushed it off at the time, thinking Marilyn was exaggerating. But after her death, when investigators searched the house, that notebook was nowhere to be found. It was not just the missing diary that raised questions. A photographer who often waited outside Marilyn's Brentwood home swore that on the night before her death, he saw unfamiliar black cars parked along the street. Men in suits went inside late in the evening and left before dawn, their faces grim, their movements hurried. The police report never mentioned those visitors. Inside the house itself, her housekeeper recalled hearing Marilyn on the phone that night. She sounded agitated, repeating the words, "You promised to protect me." The line went quiet after that. When the housekeeper tried to check on her, she was told to stay away. Hours later, Marilyn was found lifeless, and the official explanation was written in cold, clinical language: overdose, depression, nothing unusual. But for those who had truly known her, nothing about it felt ordinary. Marilyn Monroe had been planning a press conference, a bold step for a woman the world saw only as a starlet. She had chosen a journalist who had built a reputation for exposing corruption in Hollywood. She told him she had something that would shake the foundations of both Hollywood and Washington. The meeting never took place. Rumors spread quickly, but they were always drowned out by the louder narrative of a tragic star's inevitable end. Yet in private, whispers continued. A makeup artist who had worked with her confessed years later that Marilyn had spoken of overhearing conversations about Cuba, about military actions that were never supposed to reach public ears. She mentioned hearing things presidents would never admit. When the makeup artist asked why she didn't stay quiet, Marilyn replied, "Because silence is killing me faster than the pills ever could." There were others who confirmed her desperation. A neighbor recalled seeing her sitting in her garden at night, scribbling in her notebook under the glow of a small lamp. When asked what she was writing, Marilyn simply said, "The truth." The neighbor assumed it was part of a script, another one of her attempts to reinvent herself as a serious actress. Only later did it become clear that Marilyn's words had nothing to do with the film and everything to do with her life. The tragedy of Marilyn Monroe's final days lay not only in her death, but in how little people chose to believe her. She had tried to speak, but those around her were too afraid to listen. Hollywood lived on its own code of silence, one that protected powerful men and silenced women who dared to speak against them. Marilyn was no exception despite her fame. In fact, her fame made her more dangerous. A whisper from her lips could travel across the world in hours. And that was exactly why her whispers were smothered. After her death, a journalist tried to push forward with the story Marilyn had promised him. He insisted that there had been plans, notes, even recorded fragments of conversations she had kept. But when he attempted to publish, the newspaper cut the piece, calling it unsubstantiated. Shortly after, his office was broken into. The only thing missing was a tape recorder and a folder labeled M. Monroe. Decades later, collectors unearthed scraps of her handwriting from various auctions. On one page in shaky script, she had written, "If they find me dead, it was not by my hand. I wanted to live, but they would not let me speak." The page stopped abruptly, as if she had been interrupted. That fragment alone suggested that Marilyn had been aware of the danger she faced. And yet, history refused to grant her that voice. For years her name remained tied only to her beauty, her films, her tragic romances. But behind the iconic smile was a woman who had tried to tell the world one last secret, one final truth that could have reshaped how people saw not just her, but the powerful men she had been entangled with. The final secret Marilyn Monroe carried to her grave was not preserved in photographs, nor in films, nor in the countless books written about her. It existed in whispers, in fragments of testimony, in missing diaries, and in the haunting silence of those who were too afraid to confirm what they knew. And though the world chose not to listen when she was alive, the shadow of her words still lingers, leaving behind a mystery that refuses to die. In the years that followed, those closest to Marilyn Monroe struggled with their memories, torn between loyalty to her and fear of the consequences of speaking out. Some stayed silent until their own deaths, while others left behind quiet confessions in letters, memoirs, or private interviews that surfaced decades later. Each of these fragments built a mosaic of a woman who had not only carried Hollywood on her shoulders, but had also carried knowledge she was never meant to bear. One of the most chilling accounts came from a former security guard, who had occasionally worked the gates at Marilyn's Brentwood home. He recalled that in the weeks before her death, she had insisted on additional patrols around her property, telling him, "They watch me all the time now. I can feel it. Even in my own house." When the guard pressed her to explain who they were, she only shook her head and whispered, "People you don't say no to." He admitted later that at first, he thought she was paranoid, but the look in her eyes convinced him that her fear was real. Then there were the phone calls. Records from that summer showed Marilyn making a series of late-night calls to Washington, some of which were never fully explained. She had the numbers of people in high positions, people she should not have been able to reach so easily. A telephone operator later recalled overhearing her voice late one evening, urgently repeating, "I'm going to talk. I don't care what it costs me." That same operator noted that the call was cut off suddenly, as though disconnected from the other end. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Green's son, was one of the last to see her alive. He always insisted that Marilyn had been struggling with depression, but others remembered her differently. According to her housekeeper, Marilyn was oddly energized in those final days, speaking about the future, about taking control of her life. She talked of breaking free from the men who used her, of moving away from Hollywood, of finally telling her own story. She was rehearsing the way she would deliver her truth, practicing in front of the mirror as if preparing for the biggest role of her career. But the role she was preparing for was not a movie. It was her own testimony. She wanted the world to see beyond the shimmering facade of Marilyn Monroe and hear the voice of Norma Jean, the girl who had survived orphanages, foster homes, and countless heartbreaks, and who had risen to become the most recognized woman on earth. She wanted to stand as proof that even someone who was dismissed as a pretty face could expose the darkest corners of power. On the morning of August 5, 1962, her body was discovered, and with it came a flood of inconsistencies. Neighbors swore they had seen lights on in her bedroom long after the time police reported she had died. Witnesses claimed they heard an ambulance in the area. Yet no official record ever confirmed it. The police report was strangely brief, omitting details that would normally appear in such an investigation. Even the autopsy raised questions: the absence of water in her stomach despite claims of swallowed pills, the missing tissue samples, the contradictions that piled up like unanswered questions in a script no one wanted to finish. Years later, when documents were declassified, faint traces of her name appeared in government files, enough to suggest she had been monitored, her movements noted, her phone calls recorded. But the files were fragmented, entire pages blacked out, leaving only shadows where the truth should have been. The most haunting part was that these fragments confirmed what Marilyn had been trying to tell those around her. She was under surveillance and she knew far too much. Friends who dared to speak out often found themselves silenced. An actor who had once visited Marilyn in Brentwood gave an interview in the 1970s, claiming she had shown him letters she had written about conversations with world leaders. Within weeks, he retracted his statements, saying he had been misquoted. A journalist who attempted to publish an investigative piece about Marilyn's final days was pressured to stop, his editor warning him, "You're playing with fire. Let the dead rest." And so the years went on, with Marilyn's image polished and repackaged for films, posters, and souvenirs, while her truth remained buried. The world remembered her white dress over the subway grate, Her platinum hair, her breathless laugh, but not the woman who scribbled notes at night, who trembled at the sound of footsteps outside her window, who whispered of secrets too dangerous to carry alone. The tragedy was not only that Marilyn Monroe died young, but that she died unheard. She had tried to give the world her final secret, the truth that lay beneath the glamour, but the world chose not to listen. Whether out of fear, complicity, or the desire to preserve a myth, those who could have amplified her voice remained silent. And with their silence, the truth slipped into the shadows. Yet even in those shadows, her words echo faintly. Fragments of her handwriting, testimonies from those who knew her, and the chilling inconsistencies that surround her death all point to the same conclusion. Marilyn Monroe tried to tell the world something vital, something final, and we refused to hear her. That silence remains one of history's cruelest betrayals. In the decades that followed, Marilyn Monroe's legacy was carefully reshaped. Hollywood kept her alive on the silver screen, freezing her image in time as the ultimate symbol of beauty, but the woman behind the image grew more distant with every passing year. The truth she tried to speak, the final secret she wanted the world to know, slipped further into obscurity, buried beneath biographies written by strangers and endless speculation about her love affairs. Though small pieces of her voice managed to survive. In the mid-1970s, an auction surfaced with several of her personal belongings, dresses, photographs, and a few scattered notes. Among them was a half-torn page scrawled with words that puzzled collectors. If they think my silence is their victory, they are wrong. I will speak, even if no one hears. The page ended abruptly, as if ripped from its original notebook. No one could confirm its context, but those who had studied her life recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Marilyn's. Around the same time, a retired Hollywood publicist came forward with a story he had carried for years. He claimed that on the morning of her death, he received a frantic call from one of Marilyn's assistants, warning him not to speak to reporters. "They'll make it look like an accident," the voice on the other end told him. But she was ready to tell the truth. They couldn't let her. The publicist admitted he had kept silent because he feared for his own career. By the time he revealed the story, too much time had passed for anyone to act on it. Other fragments emerged in strange ways. A journalist in the 1980s uncovered an FBI memo that referenced Marilyn Monroe by name. The document described her as a security risk, noting her connections with influential individuals and her unpredictable behavior. Entire paragraphs were blacked out, but the very existence of such a file confirmed that she had indeed been watched. Why would a Hollywood actress, adored by millions, be labeled a security threat? The answer pointed back to her relationships with powerful men and the secrets she had overheard. Those who studied her life pieced together a chilling pattern. Every time Marilyn tried to break away from the image created for her, every time she attempted to control her own story, something intervened to silence her. Studios rewrote her roles, agents dismissed her concerns, and doctors numbed her with prescriptions. And when she finally decided to go beyond Hollywood and tell the world what she knew, her life was cut short. Friends who had been too afraid to speak while she lived began to share memories in their old age. One recalled Marilyn sitting at her kitchen table, chain-smoking cigarettes, and whispering about conversations that could ruin presidencies. Another remembered her breaking down in tears, clutching her diary and saying, "No one will believe me. They'll just call me crazy." These recollections painted a portrait of a woman trapped in a cycle of fear and dismissal, desperate to be heard but constantly drowned out by the roar of a world that preferred her silence. Her Brentwood home, where her story ended, became a place of pilgrimage for fans. They left flowers and letters at the gate, but few of those tributes mentioned her truth. They mourned the star, not the woman who tried to sound an alarm. Inside that house, walls had once echoed with her determination. Her rehearsals for a press conference, her late-night phone calls, her restless pacing as she tried to gather the courage to reveal what she knew. But those echoes faded, leaving only mystery. As years passed, the myth of Marilyn Monroe grew, while the reality of her final secret remained hidden. The entertainment industry thrived on her image, posters, books, films, and endless merchandise. But behind the glossy surface, questions refused to die. Why had her diaries vanished? Why had her phone records been altered? Why had those who could have confirmed her fears remained silent for so long? Some researchers spent their lives chasing answers. They combed through archives, interviewed surviving witnesses, and traced every fragment of evidence. Each time they drew close to the truth, they encountered resistance. Missing files, redacted documents, or reluctant voices that fell quiet just as the trail seemed hot. The closer anyone came to Marilyn's final secret, the more it seemed to slip away, as though the silence that had smothered her in life continued to guard her in death. And yet, the persistence of the mystery was its own kind of testimony. For if there had been nothing to hide, if Marilyn Monroe had carried no secret at all, there would have been no reason for files to vanish, for witnesses to tremble, for her words to be dismissed so aggressively. The very effort to erase her truth became proof that it had once existed. Marilyn Monroe's voice was drowned out in 1962, but the world's fascination with her endures. And with every new fragment uncovered, with every new testimony revealed, the same haunting conclusion emerges. She had tried to tell us something final, something vital. But no one listened. And in that silence lies one of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century. By the 1990s, Marilyn Monroe's story had become an industry of its own. Biographers filled shelves with glossy covers, tabloids spun tales of scandal, and filmmakers immortalized her smile. Yet in all the noise, the quiet desperation of her final days remained obscured. For those who still searched, the question was not whether Marilyn had tried to reveal a secret, it was what exactly that secret had been. Some said it was purely political, tied to the conversation she had overheard in moments when powerful men let their guard down. Others believed it was more personal, a revelation about her own exploitation in an industry that had devoured her innocence and reshaped her identity. What all accounts agreed upon was that Marilyn had grown tired of being used as a pawn, and she had reached a breaking point. She wanted to strip away the illusion and reveal something that would shatter the myths that surrounded her. A private investigator who reopened the case decades later discovered that Marilyn had scheduled an appointment with a reporter from a national paper just 2 days before her death. The meeting never happened. When he tracked down the reporter's family, they confirmed that Marilyn had reached out, promising information that would bring down giants. But after her death, the reporter was warned off by his editors, who told him the story was too dangerous to print. He abandoned the project, and soon after, his career mysteriously collapsed. There were also whispers of a little black book, a journal where Marilyn allegedly recorded phone numbers, private conversations, and dates that connected her to men at the very top of government in Hollywood. Some claimed the book was taken from her house the night she died, vanishing into the hands of those who most feared its contents. Without it, Marilyn's voice could only survive in fragments, in scattered notes, in half-remembered confessions, in the memories of those who had ignored her until it was too late. In 2005, another piece of evidence surfaced at an estate sale, a set of cassette tapes once owned by a journalist who had covered Hollywood in the 1960s. On one of them, a faint, breathless voice was heard, unmistakably Marilyn's, saying, "They think I'm just another actress, but I know things that matter. If I disappear, remember that I tried to tell you." The recording ended abruptly, as though cut off mid-sentence. Experts debated its authenticity, but those who listened swore it carried the weight of truth. Even her closest confidants, like Joe DiMaggio, hinted that Marilyn's death was not what it seemed. DiMaggio arranged her funeral quietly, refusing to allow many Hollywood figures to attend, saying bitterly, "They killed her." He never clarified who they were, but his grief carried a note of certainty. Until his own death decades later, he left roses at her grave 3 times a week, a ritual that spoke of both devotion and unspoken guilt. The tragedy was that Marilyn's secret was not some wild fantasy or conspiracy. It was painfully real. She had been exposed to the most powerful figures of her time, trusted with their intimacies, and dismissed as too fragile or foolish to understand. But she understood far more than they realized, and she wrote it down, whispered it to friends, and prepared to shout it into the world. She wanted to break free of the role she had been forced into, the laughing blonde, the plaything, the symbol. She wanted to show the world that beneath the image was a woman who had seen too much, and could no longer carry it in silence. The final years of her life were marked by a constant tug-of-war between her desire to reveal the truth and the forces determined to keep her quiet. The night she died was the climax of that struggle, and history recorded it as the tragedy of a star lost to her own demons. But those who have studied her life know better. It was not the demons inside her that silenced Marilyn Monroe. It was the world outside, a world unwilling to hear her voice. And so the story remains unfinished, lingering like an unanswered question. What was Marilyn Monroe's final secret? What had she tried to tell us? Perhaps it was written in a notebook that vanished, or perhaps it lived only in her memory. Perhaps it was political or deeply personal or both at once. What is certain is that she tried to speak. She tried to give us the truth, and no one listened. Even now, decades later, her silence feels heavier than words. The unfinished story of Marilyn Monroe's final secret hangs over her legend like a shadow, reminding us not just of the life she lived, but of the truth she carried to her grave. In the early 2000s, renewed interest in Marilyn Monroe's death stirred not from Hollywood, but from historians and investigative journalists who were tired of the tidy official story. They dug through declassified files, sifted through archives, and interviewed the last living witnesses. Each thread they pulled unraveled the myth a little more, revealing not just the tragedy of a woman destroyed by fame, but the deliberate silencing of a voice that had threatened to expose something larger than herself. One striking detail emerged from a former aide in Washington who, near the end of his life, admitted that Marilyn's name was often mentioned in hushed tones inside political circles. She knew too much, he said, his voice brittle with age. Not because she was a spy or anything like that, but because men trusted her when they shouldn't have. They thought she was too fragile, too naive to understand. But she did understand. And she wanted people to know. His statement was never officially corroborated, but it aligned with what many had suspected for decades. Marilyn had become dangerous not because of what she did, but because of what she knew. In Brentwood, her home still stood, a quiet house with white walls and iron gates, holding secrets that no investigator could fully pry open. Neighbors who had lived nearby recalled seeing unfamiliar men at her doorstep weeks before she died. Some said they wore government badges. Others insisted they were private agents, hired to monitor her. One neighbor described Marilyn as restless in those days, often pacing in her garden at night, whispering into the phone or scribbling in notebooks. She looked like she was rehearsing something, the neighbor said, like she was preparing to finally let the world hear her. Her closest friends remembered how she oscillated between courage and fear. On one hand, she was determined to reveal the truth, the conversations, the secrets, the careless confessions of powerful men. On the other, she feared that doing so would end her career or worse, her life. "I don't want to be remembered as a scandal," she told one confidant. "I want to be remembered as someone who mattered." Those words haunted the friend for years, because in the end, Marilyn was remembered for scandal and tragedy, while the part of her that wanted to matter, that wanted to leave the world a truth greater than her films, was left in silence. There were also persistent whispers of documents, letters and notes she had left behind. Some were said to have been seized the very night she died. Others surfaced in private collections decades later, their authenticity debated but never fully disproven. One such fragment read, "If I die suddenly, it was not by accident. They want me silent. But I cannot keep this inside any longer." The handwriting matched hers, and though skeptics called it a forgery, those who had studied Marilyn's life insisted it was genuine. The journalist she had planned to meet in the days before her death never spoke openly about the story she wanted to share. But in his private notes, discovered after his death, one chilling line stood out. She said she would name names. She said the world would never look at them the same way again. The notes did not specify who those names belonged to, but the implication was enough to suggest that Marilyn's secret reached far beyond Hollywood gossip. The tragedy was that her voice was drowned in the very noise created to honor her. While the world obsessed over her beauty, her relationships, her iconic roles, the essence of what she tried to reveal slipped further away. The story became one of a broken actress who succumbed to drugs, a convenient narrative that ignored the possibility that Marilyn Monroe had been more than a victim of her own fragility. She had been a woman standing at the edge of something dangerous, trying desperately to be heard. And yet, despite all efforts to silence her, Marilyn's final secret lingers. It lingers in the redacted files, in the half-burned pages of her notes, in the testimonies of those who broke their silence decades too late. It lingers in the contradictions of her death, in the inconsistencies that never added up, in the unease that has surrounded her story for more than half a century. For the world, Marilyn Monroe became an icon. But for herself, she wanted to be a witness to truths that were too heavy for one woman to carry alone. The final secret she tried to tell the world was not just about the men she loved or the rooms she was invited into. It was about the hidden currents of power that shaped her life and, in the end, took it from her. And though no one listened while she was alive, the very persistence of the mystery ensures that her voice, though faint, has never truly been silenced. By the 2010s, the mystery of Marilyn Monroe's final secret had grown into something larger than gossip or conspiracy. Academics, documentarians, and investigative reporters all tried to untangle the threads, searching for the truth she had wanted to leave behind. Each time new fragments surfaced, they painted a clearer picture of a woman who had been underestimated, silenced, and misunderstood. One documentary uncovered testimony from a former Hollywood studio executive who, late in life, confessed to attending a private gathering where Marilyn was present. He recalled her sitting quietly in a corner as men in tailored suits discussed matters that had nothing to do with movies. She wasn't supposed to hear, he said. But Marilyn had a way of blending into the room. They thought she was just decoration, but she was listening. She always listened. His words echoed what many of her friends had said. Marilyn wasn't simply a fragile starlet lost in the fog of pills and champagne. She absorbed everything around her. Another revelation came from the auction of a collection belonging to one of her doctors. Buried among mundane files was a note in Marilyn's handwriting. I know things I was never meant to know. I don't want to die with these words still inside me. The note was never dated, but experts identified the paper as matching stationery she used in 1962, the same year she passed. That single line reignited speculation, because it confirmed in her own words that she had been carrying something she believed was significant. Her housekeeper's testimony also became harder to ignore. She had always insisted that Marilyn had not seemed suicidal on the day of her death. In fact, she recalled Marilyn making plans to redecorate her home, discussing her garden, and even setting aside clothing she wanted to wear for an upcoming dinner. She was full of life, the housekeeper said. She was planning, not ending. Yet her account was brushed aside in the official narrative. There were other inconsistencies too. Witnesses swore they had seen an ambulance arrive at her home around midnight. Yet the official timeline placed her death hours earlier. Some neighbors claimed they heard shouting inside the house, followed by silence. The police report made no mention of these details. Every time questions were raised, they were answered with the same refrain. It was a simple overdose, nothing more. But nothing about Marilyn Monroe's death had ever been simple. What made her final secret so haunting was not just its content, but the way it was buried. Every fragment that survived, the missing notebooks, the suspiciously redacted government files, the testimonies hushed into silence, pointed to a deliberate effort to keep her quiet. She had tried to use her fame, her platform, to be more than the image they wanted her to be. She wanted to show the world that she was more than a face on a screen. And for that she was silenced. Yet, in silencing her, those who feared her words only gave them greater power. Each generation rediscovered Marilyn, not just as a tragic beauty, but as a woman whose final days carried an unanswered question. What had she tried to tell us? Why had no one listened? Why had those who could have confirmed her words chosen instead to preserve the myth and erase the truth? In many ways, Marilyn's final secret was not a single revelation but a pattern. A pattern of being dismissed, ignored, and used. She had witnessed the way power operated in the shadows, the way truth was bent to serve image, the way women were silenced when they threatened to speak. Her life and her death embodied that silence. And so, the legend of Marilyn Monroe's final secret endures. It lingers not only in whispers of government files or missing diaries, but in the unease that clings to her story. It is in the contradiction between the smiling star on the screen and the desperate woman scribbling in notebooks at night. It is in the gap between the world's memory of her and the reality she lived. The tragedy is that she tried to speak, and no one listened. But the irony is that in death, her silence became louder than her words. Even now, more than half a century later, we lean closer to her memory, straining to hear the voice that was smothered. We cannot know the full weight of Marilyn Monroe's final secret, but we can know this. She wanted the truth to matter. And that desire, that desperate attempt to be heard, still echoes through history. The further time carried Marilyn Monroe's story, the more her image was polished into something untouchable, and yet the more her final days seemed to resist the official version. Every new discovery, every lost interview or uncovered document, refused to let her secret die. She remained both the most visible woman in the world and the most silenced, an icon who belonged to everyone yet whose true voice was buried beneath layers of myth. By the 2010s, archivists uncovered correspondence between Marilyn and a small circle of trusted friends. In one letter, written only weeks before her death, she confessed, "I have been told to keep quiet, but keeping quiet has broken me more than the cameras or the pills ever did. I want to tell the truth while I still have the strength." The handwriting was verified by experts, and its tone carried the exhaustion of a woman who had been pushed too far. A biographer later revealed that Marilyn had begun practicing how to reveal her truth without sounding hysterical. She would sit in front of a mirror, speaking slowly, trying to steady her voice, repeating phrases like, "This is not a scandal. This is about honesty. This is about me being more than what they see." To those who dismissed her, these rehearsals sounded like the ramblings of an unstable actress. But to those who understood her pain, it was clear she was preparing for something monumental, her own final act, not on the stage or screen, but in front of the world. Her house in Brentwood, now preserved in photographs and real estate listings, was once alive with that tension. Neighbors remembered lights burning late into the night. A gardener recalled her pacing barefoot across the lawn, clutching papers to her chest, as though afraid someone would steal them from her hands. A delivery boy remembered her eyes, tired but determined, when she signed for a package, whispering almost to herself, "Not much longer now." The silencing of Marilyn Monroe did not end with her death. In many ways it began there. The missing notebooks, the inconsistent reports, the half-truths fed to the public all worked together to transform her into something she had fought against. A symbol of fragility, not strength. Yet every contradiction in her story, every trace of resistance she left behind, reminded the world that Marilyn had not gone quietly. She had tried desperately to turn her suffering into meaning. And so her legend became a battleground. On one side stood the Hollywood myth, the shimmering blonde, the tragic beauty whose life had unraveled beneath fame's weight. On the other side stood the fragments of a woman determined to speak, fragments that refused to be buried no matter how much time passed. Those fragments turned into questions that generations still asked. What had she written in the diaries that vanished? What names had she planned to reveal? What truths had she believed the world needed to hear? For her admirers, the answers mattered less than the fact that Marilyn had tried. She had fought against a system that thrived on her silence. She had stood at the edge of power, heard things she was never supposed to hear, and decided that her own voice mattered more than their threats. That courage, however brief, made her more than a star. It made her dangerous. And it was that danger, perhaps more than anything else, that led to her death being written off as a tragedy of pills and despair. To admit that Marilyn Monroe had tried to tell a final secret would mean admitting that her life and death were bound up with forces far larger than Hollywood. It would mean listening to the voice they had tried so hard to erase. Even now, as her face stares out from posters, coffee mugs, and billboards, there is another Marilyn hidden behind the icon. A woman whose truth was stolen from her, whose warning was ignored, whose secret remains unsaid. Her silence is louder than any of her words, and it lingers in the air like a question that history refuses to answer. Marilyn Monroe tried to tell the world her final secret. She tried to rise above the glittering cage built around her. But no one listened. And in that failure to hear, we lost not only the woman she was but the truth she carried. A truth that may never be spoken again. In the years that rolled into the 2020s, Marilyn Monroe's final days were revisited once more by journalists who refused to let her voice remain buried. They sifted through boxes of forgotten court records, taped interviews, and yellowing letters, piecing together an image of a woman who had been far more aware than the world ever gave her credit for. Each discovery did not solve the mystery but deepened it, pulling more people into the orbit of her silence. A researcher uncovered an interview with a Hollywood assistant who had once been tasked with delivering envelopes to Marilyn's home. Inside those envelopes, he claimed, were not scripts or contracts, but documents stamped with government seals. I never looked too closely, the assistant admitted. But I saw the markings. They weren't from a movie studio. She told me once. They think I'm safe because I'm Marilyn. But I'm not safe at all. His words hinted at how deeply entangled she had become in matters far beyond her control. Her friends had often described her as childlike, vulnerable. But those who spent long nights with her remembered something else. A sharp mind that absorbed everything around her. A photographer who had been with her at a private gathering described how she sat silently as conversations turned toward politics, war, and strategy. They assumed she wasn't listening, he recalled decades later. But she repeated their words back to me the next day, word for word. She never forgot. Marilyn's determination to be heard seemed to grow stronger in her final weeks. One makeup artist remembered her saying, "I'm tired of being their secret. I want the world to see me as I am, not as they make me." She was no longer rehearsing lines for a movie. She was rehearsing lines of truth she believed were too important to die with her. The fragments of her life that emerged painted the same picture again and again. A woman who had stepped into a world of power and influence, who had been dismissed as too fragile to understand, yet who carried within her knowledge that frightened those around her. The diaries that vanished, the letters that surfaced, the testimonies of those who had once stayed silent, all suggested that Marilyn's final secret was not some wild invention, but something real enough that others worked desperately to erase it. When she died, the official narrative smoothed over the jagged edges of her story. The world was told she had been lonely, fragile, doomed by fame. It was an easier story to accept than the possibility that Marilyn Monroe had been silenced for daring to speak. And so the myth became permanent, immortalized in black and white photographs and tragic headlines. But the questions never stopped. Every time her name was spoken, the whispers followed. Every time her image appeared, people wondered what lay beneath the surface. The truth of Marilyn Monroe was that she was not only an icon but a witness to conversations and actions that should never have reached her ears. She carried that witness with her until the very end, trying desperately to find a way to let it out. Her final secret remains just beyond reach, suspended between speculation and fact, hidden in the missing pages of notebooks and in the silences of those who were too afraid to confirm it. Perhaps it was political. Perhaps it was personal. Perhaps it was both. What mattered most was not the content alone, but the attempt, the courage of a woman who had been dismissed her whole life finally deciding that her voice mattered. And though she was silenced, her attempt has never faded. It lingers in every contradiction of her death, in every testimony that emerged too late, in every uncovered scrap of paper that carried her handwriting. Marilyn Monroe tried to tell the world her final secret, and though no one listened while she lived, the echo of her attempt still reverberates across time, refusing to be forgotten. By the mid-20th century's end, Marilyn Monroe's name had become a monument. But monuments are built to be admired, not questioned, and questioning her story was what frightened those who had power. They were comfortable with the world remembering her as a tragic blonde, a fragile beauty swallowed by her own fame. What they could not allow was for people to remember her as a woman who had tried to speak, who had reached out in desperation to tell the truth, who had prepared herself to step beyond the screen and confront the world with what she knew. Some of the most revealing accounts came from people who had nothing to gain. A nurse who had worked briefly at a psychiatric clinic recalled seeing Marilyn during a quiet moment, long before her final summer. She said Marilyn sat on the edge of a hospital bed, not crying but furious. "They think I'm weak," she whispered. "But I know their secrets. That's why they keep me drugged. Not to heal me, to shut me up." The nurse, young and afraid, said nothing at the time. But decades later, she carried the memory like a stone in her chest, certain that Marilyn had been telling the truth. Other fragments surfaced from the archives of photographers. One contact sheet from 1962 showed Marilyn in her Brentwood home, not posing but scribbling furiously into a notebook, her brow furrowed, her hair unkempt. The photographer, long dead, had written a note on the back. "She wanted me to destroy these. I never did." She said the world wouldn't understand what she was writing. The notebook itself never appeared, but the image of her bent over the page, desperate to get words out, remained a haunting reminder of what was lost. Her final weeks were filled with the duality that had defined her whole life. To the public she was dazzling, photographed at parties smiling for fans. Behind closed doors, she was pacing rooms, clutching the telephone, repeating lines like a woman rehearsing her last speech. Friends who saw her then described her as ready for war. Yet none believed she could win it. One said, "She was determined, but she was alone." And alone is the most dangerous place to be when you're holding the kind of truth she claimed to have. The night of her death became the night of contradictions. Official reports said one thing, witnesses another. Timelines did not align. Neighbors swore they heard voices in her house well after the supposed time of her passing. A police officer later admitted under his breath, "That scene wasn't clean. It was staged." But those words were never written down in any report. After she was gone, the silence became louder than her voice. The notebooks vanished. Her phone records were altered. Friends who had once sworn they would defend her memory suddenly grew quiet. The journalist who had been waiting to meet her the following week abandoned his notes, leaving behind only one line. She was ready to tell everything. The decades that followed transformed Marilyn into a symbol, but symbols do not speak, they are spoken about. Her final secret was left behind in scraps, in whispers, in testimonies given too late to matter. But the very persistence of these fragments proved something. She had indeed tried to tell the world. She had tried and she had been stopped. What makes her story so enduring is not simply the tragedy of her death, but the betrayal of her silence. For Marilyn Monroe was more than an actress, more than a face on a movie poster. She was a woman who, in her last hours, carried words that terrified the powerful and begged the world to listen. The final secret she tried to reveal remains unfinished, incomplete, like a letter torn in half. And perhaps that is why we cannot let it go. We search for her in photographs, in recordings, in interviews, not because of the glamour, but because of the unfinished sentence she left behind. Marilyn Monroe tried to tell the world her final secret. And while no one listened when she lived, the weight of her silence has outlived every film, every headline, every myth. It hangs still, daring us to ask what she was trying to say, and why no one was brave enough to hear her. Every retelling of Marilyn Monroe's life returns inevitably to that night in August 1962. It is the one point in her story that refuses to close, the wound that never healed. Her films endure, her photographs remain iconic, yet her death resists resolution. The more the world tries to frame it as a neat ending, pills, despair, loneliness, the more the cracks widen, showing glimpses of something darker. And inside those cracks lies the secret she had tried to carry into daylight. In the years after her passing, her image became a kind of shield for those who feared her truth. Posters of her laughing, calendars of her smiling, books about her romances, all of them created noise, drowning out the possibility that Marilyn Monroe had been more than a broken starlet. The industries that profited from her memory ensured that she remained an icon of beauty and tragedy, never of power and resistance. That was the cruelest irony. She had wanted to be heard, but her silence became more valuable to the world than her words ever could. Still, evidence seeped through the cracks. A lawyer who had once been connected to Hollywood's elite revealed in his unpublished memoir that he had been asked to draft a confidentiality agreement for Marilyn in 1962. She refused to sign it. "They want me muzzled," she reportedly told him. "But I wasn't born to be silent." The draft of that document vanished just like her notebooks, but the lawyer's testimony suggested what others had long suspected. Attempts had been made to buy her silence. A neighbor later recalled seeing her sitting outside late at night with a tape recorder, speaking softly into it as though dictating her thoughts. "She was whispering like she didn't want anyone to hear," the neighbor said. But she looked relieved, almost lighter, as if finally getting it out. The fate of that recorder remains unknown. Some believe it was taken the night she died. Others think it was destroyed. What matters is that Marilyn, in her final days, was desperate to leave behind a record that could not be denied. The way she rehearsed her words in front of mirrors, the way she scribbled notes in the margins of letters, the way she spoke in fragments to her friends, all of it was preparation. Not for another film, not for another publicity stunt, but for her own testimony. She wanted to step outside the role the world had written for her and deliver her own lines. But Marilyn Monroe was not allowed to finish her script. That was taken from her, cut short like a scene ended mid-frame. What we are left with is the aftermath, The contradictions, the whispers, the redacted files, the fearful testimonies. Pieces of a puzzle whose missing parts may never be found. And yet, perhaps the true tragedy of Marilyn's final secret is not that it was silenced, but that it was ignored. She tried to speak, but those around her dismissed her as unstable, dramatic, self-destructive. They failed to see that beneath her exhaustion was determination. They failed to see that behind her soft voice was urgency. They failed to believe her when she said she had something important to tell. The result is a story that refuses to die. Every decade, new generations rediscover her and ask the same questions. What did Marilyn Monroe know? What was she trying to say? Why did no one listen? And with every asking, her silence grows heavier, her unfinished testimony more haunting. Marilyn Monroe's final secret is not written in any file, not captured in any film. It exists in the space between her last words and the silence that followed, in the determination of a woman who wanted to be more than the world allowed her to be. It exists in the betrayal of a world that chose her beauty over her truth, her tragedy over her voice. And until that silence is broken, until her words are found, the story of Marilyn Monroe will remain unfinished, not as the tale of a doomed starlet, but as the echo of a woman who tried to tell the world one last secret, and was met with nothing but silence. The more the decades pass, the more Marilyn Monroe's silence feels like an accusation. She is remembered as a symbol of glamour, yes, but also as a mirror held up to a world that preferred its myths over its truths. The myth was easier. A beautiful woman destroyed by fame, undone by her own fragility. The truth, however, was something the world was not ready to face, that Marilyn had been more than a star, that she had been a witness, that she had tried to become a voice. Even those who barely knew her remembered flashes of this other Marilyn. A Hollywood photographer, years after her death, confessed that she once stopped him during a photo shoot. She lowered her voice and said, "Do you ever feel like you're carrying something too heavy? Something you can't tell anyone?" He had laughed it off, assuming it was one of her moody reflections. But when he looked at the pictures from that day, he noticed something strange. Her smile never reached her eyes. She looked as though she was trying to tell the camera something it could never capture. Others carried similar memories. A wardrobe assistant recalled her quietly humming to herself before filming, not out of nervousness, but as if calming her thoughts. "She always had papers with her," the assistant said. "Folded notes in her bag, in her coat. Once I saw names written down, circled." She snatched the paper back and said, "You didn't see that." "I never asked again." By the time Marilyn entered her final summer, she was no longer content with hints and whispers. She was restless, determined. Her phone records, though incomplete, showed repeated calls to journalists and confidants. She told them she had something too important to hide. She told them she was ready to speak. She told them she wanted to stop being an image and start being a person. But her words were met with skepticism, even dismissal. The world had grown comfortable with Marilyn Monroe as an idea, not Marilyn Monroe as a truth-teller. That dismissal may have been the greatest betrayal of all. For when she finally tried to step forward, she found herself alone. Alone in her Brentwood home, pacing with a notebook in her hand. Alone on the phone, her voice shaking with urgency. Alone rehearsing lines that she would never speak in front of cameras. The very people who should have supported her, who should have listened, turned away. And so, when the silence fell on that August night, it was more than the silence of a life ending. It was the silence of a truth erased, of a woman ignored, of a secret buried. The official story reduced her to an overdose, a tragic end. But those who knew the fragments, the missing notebooks, the vanishing tapes, the altered reports, understood that there was more. They may not have known exactly what Marilyn intended to say, but they knew this. She had been preparing to speak, and someone had made sure she never did. That is why her story continues to echo. Every retelling, every investigation, every new discovery pulls us closer to the silence she left behind. And in that silence there is a weight heavier than any photograph, any film, any scandal. It is the weight of words unsaid. Marilyn Monroe's final secret was not just about what she had witnessed, but about who she had been. She was more than an actress, more than a symbol. She was a woman who wanted her truth to matter. And though she was denied that chance in life, her determination still lingers, daring us to listen now, even when it is too late. For if history has taught us anything, it is this: the most dangerous voice is not the one that shouts, but the one that whispers, and Marilyn's whisper has never stopped. It still moves through time, through the silence, through the shadows, reminding us of what was lost when the world refused to hear her. In the end, Marilyn Monroe's story became two stories running side by side. The one the world accepted was clean, easy, and safe. A Hollywood legend whose beauty made her famous, whose fame crushed her spirit, and whose life ended too soon. It was tragic, yes, but also convenient. It allowed people to admire her image while avoiding the uncomfortable truth she had tried to reveal. The other story, the one buried in whispers and fragments, was far more unsettling. It was the story of a woman who had been underestimated all her life, who had been used by powerful men, and then dismissed as too fragile to understand them. Yet she did understand. She listened, she remembered, and she carried with her conversations that were never meant for the public. She was ready to share them. She rehearsed her words, she wrote them down, she reached out to those she trusted. She was preparing for her final act, not on screen but in reality. That act was stolen from her. On the night she was silenced, the world lost more than a star. It lost the testimony of a woman who had seen the world from both its glittering surface and its darkest corners. It lost her courage, her determination to be more than what others had written for her. It lost the truth she had carried like a burning coal in her chest. What was Marilyn Monroe's final secret? The missing notebooks, the redacted files, and the fearful witnesses leave the answer incomplete. Perhaps it was a revelation about the men who had entangled her in their lives. Perhaps it was a truth about the way Hollywood and Washington colluded in shadows. Perhaps it was something personal, a confession that would have shattered the image the world had built around her. We will never know for certain. But we do know this: Marilyn Monroe tried to tell us. She tried with every note she scribbled, every call she made, every rehearsal in front of the mirror. She tried to be heard not as an icon, not as a fantasy, but as a woman desperate to share the truth. And no one listened. That is the tragedy that lingers long after the lights of Hollywood have faded. Not that she died young, not that she was broken by fame, but that when she finally gathered the courage to speak, her voice was silenced. The world chose the myth over the woman, the smile over the words, the legend over the truth. And so her silence became eternal. But in that silence there remains an echo, the haunting sense that Marilyn Monroe's final secret still lingers unspoken, waiting in the shadows. It reminds us that behind every photograph, every film, every glamorous image, there was a woman who tried to matter, who tried to tell the world something it was not ready to hear. Marilyn Monroe's secret may never be uncovered, but her struggle to speak it endures. And that, more than any movie she ever made, is her true legacy. The reminder that even the brightest star can carry a truth so heavy it shakes the world. If only the world had listened. The final secret Marilyn Monroe tried to tell the world, but no one listened.